Welcome to another Shogi video. Today I would like to talk to you about another game that Souta Fujii played, this time as part of defense of his Eiou title against Deguchi Wakamu. He won the series with a score of 3-0, and the second game which we will see today is actually the third game of the series, because the second game finished in a repetition, and for that reason players exchanged colors and then replayed the game to see who would prevail as the winner of the second game of this match. In this game, Fujii played with Sente and Wakamu played with Gote. Fujii opened with static rook, to which Wakamu replied with a double static rook. And after a few typical opening moves, we eventually see the pawn push on the 8th file. And now, in this position, Wakamu decides to allow a bishop exchange, which Fujii obliges to, and so now we land in a typical kind of a bishop exchange opening. And Wakamu decides to take this pawn on 7f. This is obviously kind of a risky move, which has some drawbacks, but also, of course, advantages in the sense that you can later maybe also threaten something against this king position. Fujii seizes this opportunity to attack via the second file, and he does so in a very, very violent way. So after the move silver to 2b, we reach the first very critical position of the game, in which Fujii completely surprised me with the move that he played. It's a move which I think I would have never played, and I'm also not sure if it's objectively good or not, but it's definitely very, very interesting idea. Maybe you can pause the video and you can think about it yourself. Well, Fujii actually dropped his bishop to 2a. What's the idea? Well, first of all, of course, you attack the gold. But my first inclination when I saw the move was, okay, why can't he just go back and attack the bishop? And I think Fujii's idea here was to drop a pawn. And I tried to analyze this a little bit, now using computer from this position, and it's actually quite unclear. So, for instance, there's this bishop drop attacking the rook. You can go back. Now it's very important that you go back to I. Why? Because your opponent still has 3 pawns in hand. So when he drops pawns, you always want to take them with the rook. And in this way, you can take as many pawns as possible. Actually, that's what he should do. For instance, to drop a pawn right now. And at some point, maybe even here, now Fujii would have been forced to take here. Probably not a good idea to take the rook at this point, because then you can just take the gold. But maybe just take back. And then continue with the same maneuver, this pawn drop, and eventually either the bishop or the rook will probably fall, but the position is still just horribly complicated, and I have no way of assessing this objectively. Well, so instead of going back with the gold, Wakamu played another move, which is a kind of obvious candidate move, namely to just attack the rook. If the rook goes back, now you could just capture the bishop eventually without losing so much material. So for that reason, he didn't do that, but he now showed his idea, I guess, with this bishop drop, namely to sacrifice the full rook. Very, very interesting. And I think after both lines, after both this silver move and after the gold move, the position is just very, very difficult to assess. Now Wakamu, of course, took the rook, because if you take the promoted bishop, the main issue here is that you just have pieces in hand which move diagonally, namely these bishops, so you can't drop a gold to a, which would be a very, very nice move. But you just have these diagonal pieces in hand, and of course this looks very, very awkward in terms of defending against pieces which now can just attack it without ever being threatened here. So that was not possible. So for that reason, Wakamu was basically forced to take the rook. And now Fujii comes with another interesting move, the pawn drop to 8b. These are the moves which really show the class of the top players, that they now, is it now the right time to, do I have the time to play these pawn drops to disrupt the opponent's pieces, or does he have a more direct way of attacking me then? But here, at least Wakamu judged that, he doesn't have a direct way of attacking, but instead just played his knight away, and now Fujii skillfully sacrificed his pawn. And now compared to the position 2 moves before, we see that these 2 pieces are now much worse placed in terms of defending the king. And so the castle of Wakamu has become a lot weaker than before. So at this point, maybe you can pause the video again and you can think about the best move for Fujii. Fujii played a very, very interesting gold drop, namely the gold drop to 4d. It's a bit of a rare motive, I would say, and it's again based on the fact that Wakamu doesn't have any gold in hand. If he had a gold in hand, he could probably just drop it again to 4b, but this is not really possible. So for that reason, this strange motive of a gold drop to 4d is possible. First of all, of course, you cannot really take the gold, because then you can get the rook back, and now the rook drop to 2b is looming, and the king of Wakamu is just much, much weaker than the king of Fujii. Instead, Wakamu went with the move rook to 8f. The main idea is just to defend against bishop takes, check, followed by bishop takes on 7f. But this feels, of course, a little bit slow, so I think by this point it's fairly clear that Fujii has taken control of the game. Wakamu went back. Note that you can't go and run here because of, either you take and you take the gold, or you take here and you take the rook, so you even have the choice. So you have to go back. But now it looks pretty dangerous for Wakamu, because you have 2 pieces very close to the king, and already the promoted bishop to 4b threatens a checkmate. And the other checkmate which is threatened here is that the bishop takes the gold, followed by a gold drop on 6b. So for that reason, Wakamu decided to strengthen his control of the second rank, the B rank, so which with this rook move back to 8b. And Fujii now just worsened the position of this rook. Very nice pawn drop. Of course, again, you cannot take because of checkmate. And Wakamu withdrew his rook to 9b. And Fujii even goes one step further and now drops another pawn, this time to 7b, to make this rook look even more ridiculous than before. Note that if you take, which might seem natural, then you can just take back. And now either you go back, in which case you have another pawn drop, and now you again threaten to take the gold. Or you go somewhere here, and then you got more problems to solve. And even if you go to 2b, probably there's just a pawn drop to 2c, which then would lead to a similar outcome. So really skillfully, Fujii managed to get this rook completely out of game. Now at this point, Wakamu realized that his king is in very, very big danger, and for that reason decided to give up a bishop to finally get a gold in hand and to be able to put some resistance to the attack on his king. He took the gold to avoid the checkmate, and now he played the gold up to 5b. Now you can see that Fujii does not have so many pieces in hand left. So this is the big downside of what he did, that he's still down material, but on the other hand, this rook is not really worth that much, so it seems that he's still in control. He went with a promoted bishop to eventually get another piece on 5c. This could be either the knight, which lands via this route, or it could be maybe a silver, which is dropped here, or maybe later a gold which is dropped here. So this is of course the idea that he now has, but he is not really fast here. At the same time, his king is also still relatively safe, and his opponent doesn't have a knight, which would be kind of nasty as a drop on 7f, but he doesn't have this knight, so not so easy for Wakamu as well to attack. So Wakamu now starts with something, again, first disrupting the castle, and now disrupting the castle even more, and now finally he comes with a rook drop, threatening a gold drop to 6i. But yeah, of course, Fujii defends against this at the cost of a lance. Also kind of a typical attacking motive that you threaten something and then take the lance. But this lance also comes at a pretty high price now for Wakamu, because after this nice pawn drop to 2i, his promoted rook is completely out of game. Fujii is still relatively slow, so his game feels relatively slow, but it's very, very hard to suggest something which is quick for Wakamu here, and he didn't come up with something which is very quick. Instead, he went for the third file. Yeah, and now Fujii plays one of the plans that I alluded to before, to bring another piece to 5c, which then will put enormous pressure on the king. Wakamu ignores it for the moment and probably hopes that he can, after a promotion, he can just ignore it for a bit more and maybe run at some point. But Fujii now plays another very interesting move, namely this bishop drop to 4f. It's a very nice move because it's an attacking move on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also a bit of a defensive move because it threatens to bring the knight to 4e, and then to take the promoted rook. Wakamu is undeterred and just takes. But now after bishop takes silver, he does not pursue his attack with this move, which, at least according to the computer, was an interesting possibility. It looks extremely dangerous, I would say, because the king is now attacked from two sides. But the computer says it's the only way to stay in the game for Wakamu, but still Fujii would have been better here also, according to the computer. Instead, Wakamu goes for a move which I could also have thought of, namely just dropping the gold to attack the bishop. And now Fujii goes for a very direct attack with this silver drop. And here it becomes clear that Wakamu's play is just too slow, because if he takes, let's say here, then after a sequence like this one, promotion, and this, we would have a checkmate. So for that reason, now Wakamu starts to run, but this is obviously very slow, and now Fujii just takes and very calmly retreats his bishop. I think there were more ways to play here, but this is quite a strong move because it prevents further progress of the pawn. At least then you would lose the rook, and so it costs Wakamu another move here, bringing the rook back. And now Fujii doesn't even take the pawn, but he goes for a direct attack with this very strong move. Bishop to 5c, a multi-purpose move. First purpose is to just threaten silver move to 4c unpromote, which would lead to a very strong attack. Let's say unpromote, let's say something like this. Takes, and now the king is just way too open, so there's different ways of mating, I guess. And the gold drop on 3e is a mate. Instead, Wakamu decides to defend against this, but this is also not a good idea, so maybe you can look for the finishing touch by Fujii. Okay, maybe you found it. It's a very nice retreat by the bishop, attacking the king and the promoted rook, so now he will just take the promoted rook in the next move and be up tons of material finally, after being down tons of material for most of the game, and still have his crushing attack on the king. So for that reason, Wakamu resigned. Well, very, very interesting game by Fujii. This bishop drop on 2a, where I still don't know how good it is objectively, but in a practical game, definitely very, very interesting to try that. Then later on, this gold drop to 4D, very unusual idea. Maybe not super hard to spot, but very, very unusual. And then all of these little tactics against the rook with this very skillful pawn drops throughout the game, which I think decided the game in his favor, together, of course, with this great coordination of his pieces, in contrast to Wakamu's pieces, which, despite the material advantage, couldn't really play so well together. Well, that's it for today, and see you next time.